Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's installment in the Globe webinar series on the future of global governance. I am Alexander Moylan of the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies at KU Leuven, and I will be moderating today's discussion. We're joined by Professor Jan Eeckhout to discuss his book, The Profit Paradox: How Thriving Firms Threaten the Future of Work, published in 2021 by Princeton University Press. Jan Eeckhout is research professor at the University of Pompeu Fabra, as well as research professor of economics at University College London. He has both teaching and research interest in macroeconomics, with a special emphasis on the labor market. And he studies unemployment, labor market risk, skill diversity, inequality in cities, and the macroeconomic implications of market power. Also joining us today as discussant is Professor Valeria Pulignano, who is full professor at the Center for Sociological Research at KU Leuven. Her research focuses on comparative European employment, labor, market dualization, and inequality. Her areas of expertise range from European economic and political integration, social dialogue and collective bargaining, workers' voice, and systems of representation, among many others. We will begin today's webinar with a presentation by Jan of about 25 minutes. Then Valeria will start off the discussion by offering some reflections and asking some questions. And Jan will have, of course, the opportunity to respond. Then we will turn to questions from the audience. So please feel free to send me questions throughout the webinar by using the webinar chat box function at the bottom of the webinar window. And then I will share your questions with the speakers following the presentations. Before we begin, just a few questions about the GLOBE project. For those of you who are not familiar with our research, it is funded by the European Commission's Horizon 2020 program, and it seeks to understand the constraints and opportunities for the European Union in promoting its interests and values through global governance, with a specific attention to 4 key areas: trade and development, security and migration, climate change, and global finance. And so the project aims to identify the major roadblocks to identifying a coherent global governance by multiple stakeholders in a multipolar world, as well as look ahead to 2030 and 2050 in order to equip policymakers with the tools they need to deal with future challenges. So on behalf of the GLOBE project, I would really like to thank both Jan and Valeria for joining us today. And it's now my great pleasure to give the floor to Jan. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you so much for the kind introduction. I'm really excited to talk here, especially about the kind of the setup of this research project, in the sense that a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today has to do with global issues and therefore global responses. And that's also why I'm quite excited to hear what you have to say on this. You know, this is an interdisciplinary audience, and I'm really curious to hear a lot about the opinions and views that you have on this issue. I'm also looking forward to Valeria's discussion, and let me try and introduce the talk by taking kind of a comparison with something from the classroom. If you think about, one kid being bullied by another, then one child suffers. And if a teacher doesn't care, then maybe 20 children suffer. Now, if the whole education system is broken, then millions suffer. And the point I try to make in the book is that really there's a system that's broken. Now, to find out what that system is, let me take you back to a meeting I had about 2.5 years ago with a friend of mine, Alex. And Alex, I hadn't seen him for a while, and I meet him and I say, Alex, how's life? How's life in California? He lives in Silicon Valley. And after we greeted each other, he's kind of a little bit disappointed and tells me really I'm moving out. I'm moving back to Europe. It hasn't worked. I've been trying to start up a firm to set up a business there in the tech industry, and it hasn't worked. So I'm moving out, and I see no future, no hope for doing it again. Now, as he's explaining this to me, from the corner of our eyes, we see a news report, and it was then the Dow Jones reaching 25,000. And the news anchor was talking about how amazing good news that was for the economy, how healthy the economy was because of the fact that the stock market was at such a high. And as we're talking, also the bartender comes in, brings us the beers that we had ordered, and the bartender says, well, you know, I don't believe that story, or at least I don't see it, because, you know, I've been doing this job since 2004, and I'm taking home exactly the same wage today as I did back then. So the big question is, how can it be that on the one hand we have this amazingly positive news, the stock market reaching new highs, and at the same time, you know, a startup entrepreneur who cannot get the businesses off the ground, the bartender who's, you know, a traditional service worker who gets a wage that hasn't grown for more than a decade, nearly 2 decades. How can it be that these two things coexist? And I'm going to argue that the reason why that is, and I argue that in the book, that there's a system that's broken, and the system that's broken is actually maybe contradictory, and that's why I call it the profit paradox, that there is actually not enough competition, that there is lack of competition between firms, because the reason why a small number of firms make such high profits, and by the way, it's a small number of firms because these stock market indices, the Dow Jones, for example, is for 30 firms. And even if you look at the S&P 500, it's, well, 500 firms. There's in the United States alone 6 million firms. The estimates for the world are there's over 100 million firms. So we're talking about a very small number of firms. Our data tells us between 300 and 400 firms, global firms, but that are of course extremely large and therefore extremely influential in the economy. And what happens is that these successful firms are doing this not because just they're innovating, which they also do, but because they basically face too little competition from other firms, and this has a negative effect on smaller firms, on startups, and it has a negative effect on the labor market. Now you will probably ask, you know, what are the facts? And so let me start with some of the facts. Let me start with the Dow Jones that I told you about at the outset. You know, if you look at the Dow Jones adjusted for inflation, this may be a surprising fact to you. It was when I saw this series for the first time, is that if the evolution of the Dow Jones until the 1980s, and we're going back to World War II, you know, for the first 35 years saw virtually no growth. The level of the Dow Jones in the early 80s was at the same level as it was in just after the Second World War. Now, the big rise in the stock market started in the 1980s. So there's a turning point in 1980 where things change, and we see this profitability rising very sharply in 1980. And what does that mean? What it means is that, you know, the way the pie of the economy is being divided is actually taking different shares. You can think of the pie of the economy as being the pie of a typical firm. About 2/3 of the surplus that a firm generates, and therefore that the economy generates, goes to workers and wages. About 1/3 goes to machines, but that could also be, of course, investment in software. It doesn't have to be machines, but is investments. And whatever is left over in the firm or in the larger economy is profits. And in 1981, we had profits that were around 2%. Now, what has happened over time? We have seen that these profits have started to grow, and by 2019, these profits were 19%. Now, what it means, of course, is if you have high profits, that is reflected in stock market valuations. But we already know that this is not the profits of all firms. This is the profits, this 14% of the entire pie in the economy is going to a small number of firms. And that's why it's so striking that these profits are so high and these stock market valuations are so high for a few firms, because most firms actually see a decline in profits. So we see in our data that the profit distribution has become much more dispersed, and most of the firms see lower profits, and a handful of firms see enormous rises in profits, and that reaches 14% of the total economy. Now, the story I told you about, you know, my friend Alex is not just the story of one person, it's actually something that we see in the data, because when we look at the fraction of startups of all firms, in the late 70s, early 80s, that was around 14%, just below 14%. And what has happened is, by the way, the fraction of startups, I look at all the firms in the economy and I measure how many of these firms are new firms, are newly started up firms. And what happened since the 1980s is that the startup rate has started to decline, and it went down all the way to 7-8%. So that's just over half of what it was in the early 80s. Now, if I go back to Alex's story, one of the reasons why he decided, after many years trying to kind of launch several startups, was that in the last case he had a business that had a kind of an innovative peer-to-peer communication system, and one of the big producers of mobile devices was interested in in implementing this, and they were going to take over his firm. And for 2.5 years they were in negotiations about this takeover, and in the end, because they're so dominant, their own engineers managed to basically use the information they had from his developments, and they implemented it themselves. And that basically meant the end of his startup, but it also meant that he didn't want to start a new firm or try a new startup again. And this is something that we see reflected in the data. You would think, you know, this is a digital age where a lot of innovation is going on in Silicon Valley, but people in Silicon Valley talk also about the fact that the number of startups that are coming about have declined. And it's not just the startups in Silicon Valley, it's economy-wide. This is important. The startups are important because the startups are really the building blocks of the economy. These are the firms that hire most workers, they hire more young workers, and they innovate more. These are the fastest growing firms, startup firms. This is something that's very salient in the data. And so now if you reduce the number of startup firms to half, you reduce the building blocks of the economy, and you reduce the innovation and the hiring in the economy. Now, the same thing can be said actually about the wage stagnation. We had the story of the bartender, but the bartender story is not just the story of one person. What I'm going to show you in the next graph is basically the evolution of productivity, so basically how much the average worker produces, together with the evolution of wages. And this is the wages of production and service workers, like the bartender. This is around 85 to 90% of the entire economy. So this is most workers. This excludes things like managers and CEOs, but most of the workers are included in here. And what we see is that since the Second World War, again, since the late 1940s, we see the evolution of wages and productivity going in tandem. And then since 1980, wages, production and service wages have started to stagnate. And so you see this disconnect, this spread between what happens to productivity and what happens to wages. And so the story of the bartender is, as I said, not just the unique story. There's underlying a lot of heterogeneity too, and wage inequality. Let me show you the evolution of the same type of wages. We only have data since the 60s, not since the Second World War, by schooling. We have 4 categories here: high school or less, so basically people who dropped out or had went to high school, those who had 2 years of college, those who had 4 years of college, and those who had professional degrees more than 4 years of college. So that's master's degrees, PhDs, MBAs, and so on. And what happens to the evolution of these wages is that until the 1980s, they actually evolve quite in a parallel fashion. And then from the 1980s onward, they start to spread out. And we see basically that there's, you know, an increase in the inequality. But the most striking thing to observe here is that, of course, the ones with the highest level of education, they see quite a substantial wage gain from around 45%. But all the others, including those with college, see a much more modest gain. In fact, some of them see a decline. And the most striking fact here is that the people with high school or less see actually a 15% decline in their wages. So this wage stagnation is really coming from these 3 bottom categories, and even within them there's inequality, and this is another implication that this inequality is rising substantially. Now, let me show you kind of, an issue, or try to relate how much of this is going on just in the United States, how much of this is going on around the world. What I have here is I have data on what we call the markups, and this is a measure of market power. It says how much firms can sell their goods at a price that's above cost. Okay, and the markup is basically this margin. And what we see, I'm going to show you the evolution of these markups. This is the average markup for the whole economy around the world, in the United States, sorry, in not the United States, but North America. So that's the US, Canada, and Mexico, then Europe and Asia. And what we see in this evolution is, in fact, that this is happening very similarly everywhere around the world. Okay, the world evolution of these markups is a measure of how dominant these firms are and how much higher can they sell their products compared to cost. It was around 10% above cost. Now it's around 60% of cost, and that's true for North America, for Europe, for Asia. There's obviously small differences, but the general trend is similar. And that tells us that this is not just a phenomenon for the United States. This is a phenomenon that's actually global. And this is the Globe seminar. I want to stress, the problem is global, so then will also be the solutions. Okay, and this is something that I hope that it's going to come up in the discussion after this presentation and the discussion by Valentina. Okay, so basically we have a kind of an evolution and a set of consequences. So now the big question is, how did we get there? What is it that had us reach this situation? And the answer is that it's actually what we find in the data. It's driven very much by fast technological change. And what happened in the 1980s? 1980s is really the period when we see the sharp increase in the use of digital technology. And of course, there's different stages. Initially, it was just about having, desktop computers. Then it became the type of web products that were being offered. Then it was mobile. So there's many different stages. Now it's big data, it's artificial intelligence. So this is evolving as we speak. But this is really the digital age that's kicking in. And this type of fast technological change is, I would call, in the movie of the economy, it's both the hero and the villain. It's a hero because if you look at many of these firms, what they've been doing is they've been innovating enormously. Look at what Google has done since the 90s, or what even Apple and Microsoft did in the 70s. This was enormously innovative, and that's the hero part. This type of innovation gives us growth. This type of innovation gives us higher quality of life. I mean, it's beyond any doubt that this technological change has made life better for virtually everyone, without an exception. The problem is that the same technology, the same technological change is often used or has consequences that restrict the competition between firms. And let me give you the example of a firm like eBay. eBay is a platform, and it's a platform that was founded in the mid-90s. And what they did, or what they do there, is they allow users to come on there and buy and sell. In a sense, it's a very competitive marketplace. What is not so competitive is to get on the marketplace, in the sense that anyone can get on there. But the thing is that you pay commissions of, say, 7 or 8% that they charge for each transaction. It doesn't cost them that much. It costs them less than 0.5%. But what happens is that if another firm wants to come into that market and offer a competing platform, as Yahoo Auctions has done for many years, then they cannot really get customers to come to them. Why is that? Because if I'm a seller, I want to be on a platform where all the buyers are. If I'm a buyer, I want to be on a platform where all the sellers are. I really want a large platform. And that's what we call network effects. And these network effects are a source for having, really one big platform, not two competing platforms. But that implies that these network effects don't allow for competition in the market. There's a lot of competition, on the platform, but there's no competition for building a platform. And these scale economies, so to speak, these advantages of being big, generated by the new technology, keep competitors out. And as the competitors are kept out, your commissions and your fees are high. And this is not just for eBay. This is also, for example, for the Apple Store. Those of you who follow the the dispute with Epic Games, one of the providers, who refused to pay the 30% commission that they had to pay to Apple. This was again, you know, a dominant position of a company like Apple that was exploiting these network effects. Now, this is not something that is new. This has happened before. In fact, if you go back to 1900, then we saw something very similar, because what the new technologies were then, the fast technological change, was oil production, electricity, and railway transportation. And at that time, what we saw was the fast creation of very dominant firms. Standard Oil, for example, by Rockefeller. He was dominating the network of oil supplies and production and refineries. And the same thing with JP Morgan, who was the financial owner of the big consolidated company that owned the railway companies in the United States. And so this period of fast technological change was also a period in which new technologies came on board, or kind of became available, that had huge scale advantages. These are all examples of scale, you know, generating a lot of value. I mean, you don't want to compete with two railway lines next to each other. The same way, and we still haven't figured it out, how to regulate, for example, the electricity industry. Really, scale is of utmost importance. And so what that generated then was exactly a similar effect, which had a number of firms having enormous dominance, charging prices that were enormously much higher than what their costs were. But that was a small fraction of the entire number of firms that were in the market. And it created the same type of lopsidedness in this profitability. And it had very similar consequences in terms of wages and the effect on smaller businesses. This is not a new thing. Also, back then, it generated inequality and polarization, something that we're seeing today too. Unfortunately, the way it was resolved back then was with 2 world wars and a Great Depression. And so the question is, can we do better now? Can we anticipate what is, you know, evolving? And this drive towards the dominance of these large firms is not stopping anytime soon. So this is going to continue unless we intervene. Now the question is, how can we intervene? And the first, you know, way to think about an intervention is definitely not, I think, blindly splitting up firms. Sometimes it may help to split up firms, and especially when you think about the mergers and acquisitions, it's a good idea to probably stop some of these firms merging, so you don't have to split them up afterwards. But really, a lot of these advantages, I can give you the example of eBay, I can give you the example of Amazon. These firms have grown because they're really exploiting the scale advantage. And this scale advantage is precisely what gives rise to this large kind of dominant position. You know, let me use kind of the image that Warren Buffett uses. He says, you know, when I want to give you an advice how to invest in a castle, make sure that the castle is big, that the castle is valuable, and then make sure that you have someone in charge of the castle, a duke or whoever is the person who's running the castle, who knows the ins and outs of the castle. But above everything else, make sure that there's a huge moat around it. And the moat is basically the inability of competitors to come in. And the point of the new technologies is precisely that they have created this large moat. They've created the inability for a small number of firms with enormously valuable castles to face no competition in their markets. But there is something we can do, because these, you know, markets, as I said, are very often networks, are very often platforms. And what we can do is to separate the platform or the network from the operation on it. And you can think of this as, well, we don't want two railway lines next to each other, but we want different competitors on the same railway line. And you can think of this as being a platform in the digital age technology that is going to be separate from the users and operators on this platform. And we have an example where this actually works today like that. The example I can give you, my example of my phone plan that I have in Spain with Movistar, and the plan that I use in the United States with AT&T. With AT&T, I pay about 2.5 times as much as I pay with Movistar. And you think, well, what's the difference? The technology is the same. I use the same device. I also know that it's 4G or 5G. The cell network and the technology of that cell network is the same. So what's the difference? Well, there's one piece of information, legislation rather than information, that the EU imposes that says if you are the owner of a cell tower network, you have to allow competitors on it in exchange for a rental price. And that rental price is set by the European Commission. Now, the owners of the cell towers don't like this, because what happens is that, say on the Spanish network, a Polish provider comes and they enter this market and they say, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to try to attract customers. I'm going to lower prices. That's how I do this. So in response, the local owner is going to have to lower prices too. And this is basically how you get this competition. The network is not split up. The network is what's creating the value in the first place, but you have competition on the network through this regulation. And I believe that these are ways in which we can create competition. People call this interoperability. This is a term that's coming from the computer science community, but this is not something just for the mobile phones. This is also for networks like, or platforms like eBay. It's also for less kind of more traditional sectors like textiles, a company that has a distribution network, or an Amazon that has a network that is in retail, a very traditional sector, but that is using these new technologies to basically generate this powerful position with a big moat around its castle. So, again, there is the solution, and I think that we have to be we can be optimistic that there's a way in which we can achieve competition, because the ultimate objective is to have more competition. But by generating more competition, we can actually lower the prices, and this is going to reduce all these negative effects that we talked about there. So just in sum, next time you hear a news report about the Dow Jones reaching new highs, we're at 37,000 right now. I'm pretty sure we're going to be at 40,000 sometime soon, and who knows where it's going to end. The next time you hear that news report, I hope I can convince you to think twice, and think twice because it's not, just good news. It's good news for those few dominant companies, but it's not good news for the economy. It's not good news for the health of the economy, because there's basically too little competition. Now, we know from history that this doesn't always end well. This has generated in the past and today polarization and inequality. But I think that if you're not careful, we really don't want to resolve it like we did it in last century with 2 wars and a Great Depression. But as they say, history rhymes, it doesn't repeat. So there's ways in which we can avoid that history repeats. And the main challenge is to induce more competition, to ensure that there's more competitors. And one way to do that is with these new technologies to separate, the network from the operators, in order to improve the possibilities for competing startup firms, for competing providers, and ultimately to generate the positive effects that they have on things like labor markets, on inequality and polarization. Thank you very much. I'm looking really forward to hearing your comments.
Thank you so much for your presentation, and for giving this very interesting overview of some of the key arguments, key ideas in your book. Now, of course, it's our pleasure to give the floor to Valeria, who will kick off today's discussion. Before I do so, I would just, of course, like to also remember that our audience is very much welcome to take part in our discussion. So please do send us your questions, and we will share them with our speakers later on in the webinar. Valeria, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Alex, and thank you very much for inviting me to give some thoughts about this wonderful book. So I would like to really congratulate and to say thanks to Jan for having written this book. I think we need it, and I enjoyed it very much reading it. I think it's a must reading for all those who are in fact interested in understanding more about the processes of, let me use this terminology from a sociological perspective, capital accumulation and concentration in the current era. And I say it really truly that after having read the book of Thomas Piketty on the 21st century and many other books, including Paul Krugman, and last but not least, Joel Bakan's on the new corporations, how good corporations are bad for democracy, I really consider this book as one of my favorites. I really enjoyed reading it. Yeah, thanks again. So let me get into the discussion. Well, first of all, I would like to put some thoughts, and then I will move on in pointing some element for questions and debate from my also perspective. So as I said, I think that the profit paradox is a very interesting book, because when I was reading it, it gave me a really truly realistic story about how over the past 40 years this kind of bunch of companies have reaped most of the rewards of technological advancement, as you have shown to us, Jan, acquiring also rivals, securing huge profits, creating, you know, this kind of unequal outcomes for work and for workers. Now, the concentration of power in these large innovative companies, well, we do know that has been a characteristic of capitalism since its origins. And while reading your book, although of course the narrative is much more complex and is completely different, but it brought me back into Marx's ideas of, capital accumulation, as I said before, and also capital concentration. So these large technological oligopolies and transnational cartels constitute, in fact, a fundamental engine of economic, social, and technological transformations, but also, as you have pointed very well, they are a primary cause also of class polarization, as you said, political instability, and sometimes also, we should add, war. Which is quite scary, but that's where I think perhaps we should also reflect upon. Now, this is, quite interesting. As I said, there is a lot of novelties if we, look at what is happening today and what was happening in the past. But the kind of mechanism also different, but the processes are quite common. And I found a lot of commonalities in the story you presented, particularly, looking at this, what has been also defined predatory capitalism. Now, in fact, I think what I particularly appreciated is how you really, in a very easy but also interesting way, explain the kind of passing of these on the benefits of better technology to consumers through lower prices, and how these large corporations also leverage this new technology to change even higher prices, as you also shown to us in the presentation, and extend this predatory character on a large scale. Now, if I look at it from a European perspective, and particularly look at the effects on wages and workers, which is, something which interests me most. I think we see it very clearly. Now, you showed it also in your different picture, but we know that wage inequality, in fact, in Europe increased substantially. Particularly, I would say, up and during the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. We also see that since then, it has on average remained relatively stable, nevertheless, or even in little bit decreased in terms of hourly wage. But although the overall decline in wage inequality can be there attributed to a decrease in inequality in the upper half of the wage distributions, as the wages between the top and the median converged, however, we see in Europe that inequality in the bottom half of the wage distribution remained stable, actually increased. These particularly during, I would say, 2016, 2017. And if we look, and there was quite intrigued by your story now, kind of intersecting your story with the data presented, for example, the last one on the benchmarking in Europe report published by the European Trade Union Institute 2021 shows that after a collapse of wage growth during 2020-2021, we observed a very slight recovery of nominal wage growth in 2021. And also we see the data indicate that this recovery, a little bit of nominal wages growth, only partially translate into a correspondent recovery of real wage growth. So this really shows very clearly, just to support a little bit in terms of your data, in fact, you are absolutely right. There is a kind of decoupling of wage and productivity developments, which continued also in 2021. So we really need, from a policy perspective, to take action on this. And here I come to my a little bit, mood of discussion and a question over to you. Now, my question was, by reading this, okay, so we know there is this big problem we have in front of us. How do we go with it? I think your book offers interesting output in there in thinking how we can do that. I was also reflecting whether, and there is also my question to you, whether, when we look at the relationship between changes in wages, but also changes in collective bargaining coverage. And so if we bring a little bit also this other variable into the basket, and we look in fact at the relationship between changing collective bargaining coverage, the relative value of minimum wages, and the changes in wage inequality. This also says, I think, now from my perspective, says also quite a lot. And demonstrate that some, in fact, of the national variation in wage inequality can be explained by all these kind of factors. So if so, and we do know we have, hopefully will go till the end, a very new introduced proposal for a directive in Europe on minimum wages, which is not just the minimum wages, but is also about reinforcing collective bargaining structures, reinforcing institutions, regulatory institutions. Let me put again, in the industrial relations, labor market arena. So this could be also another way to, kind of a thing in terms of how can we go in terms of fixing this kind of gaps and problems. Now, I missed a little bit, and, absolutely in a positive way, this is story in your book, and that's why absolutely with all the, you cannot write a book with many things in. So, but I wanted to ask you now, as I get the opportunity, what is your view about this? How do you see that? For example, in your study, which is very encompassing of different regions, different parts of the world, do you see, okay, there is a lot of commonalities, but there is also a lot of variation. So what can we learn about that, and how can we go about that? Another point which I wanted to raise for discussion. Well, I was reading a recent studies that was published by Mackey and Morris in 2020, which advance important argument in the sense that the authors think that there is some ground to believe that the pandemic forced some companies, and in these companies, they are the ones that you mentioned as well, to improve efficiency by optimizing their process through increased digitalization and automatization. Now, the story of the technology is very central in your book, is very important, very strong. And I just was wondering, how do you see that? Would you also agree with this argument, or would you see something different? So how the pandemic, in other words, is reinforcing these very, very brutal tendencies and worrying tendencies that you are talking about. And last but not least, perhaps going to the core of your argument, it seems to me you really point and say, listen, we need to, in fact, find a way to let competition coming back and letting these companies competing, because competition is the way, as you said at the very end, through which we could in fact benefit everybody, consumers, and workers as well. Now, I don't know whether I get this argument right, but we know, and I'm sure you share my same point, that also are we thinking in terms of a kind of invisible ends, like in neoclassical economics, or are we able to equilibrate the forces of the market, or are we thinking in terms of a more different sort of story, which seems to me comes out of your book, when we think about also kind of actors like the state, for example, and other important institutions trying to, regulate the arena and regulate also the kind of way in which competition should work and how should be developed. I think in Europe we have seen a lot in terms of how the effect of this competition on working conditions of workers. So I just wanted to just ask this to you and hear what you think in terms of what kind of competition do we need here, what kind of characteristic, and how these cannot let thriving firms to threaten the future of work, which is something that we really need to do for the future. Thank you very much, and hope I have not used so much time.
Thank you, Valeria, for these very insightful, thoughtful comments, and of course points for discussion. Jan, would you like to give us your thoughts?
Definitely. So first of all, Valeria, I want to thank you enormously for a thoughtful and deep discussion. I mean, it's, not only have you read the book, you've analyzed it. So I'm really grateful for doing that. You touched on a number of issues. Let me come to the last three that you listed in terms of the question directly. We can then come back to some of the issues that you discussed. So from the outset, let me tell you that on the three questions that you asked me, before I forget, I agree with all the 3 points that you made, but let me tell you a little bit more in detail what I think about that. So first of all, institutions like collective bargaining and unionization, you didn't mention it, but let me add to that, taxation is, it's an institution, it's a way to redistribute. These are, missing institutions, and if anything, if you make a comparison between, say, the United States and Europe, we tend to have more of these institutions. At least they still today have more of an impact than they have in the United States. And let me give you the example. I mean, it's clear that collective bargaining and that unionizations, minimum wages, that these have lost strength or impact, but they are still very much around. And let me give you the impact that has on things like inequality. There is this puzzle that many people talk about, is that the inequality, or typically measured as the skill premium, I don't want to enter into detail, but there's one measure of inequality in France has been stable for the last 3 decades. Now, recent work has shown that while this is true for what people have in terms of take-home income, what has happened in France is that, the payroll tax has become a tax that was, enormously regressive because it had a maximum, to one that became linear to becoming very progressive. And now, of course, the amount of wage cost that the firm has and the inequality in that wage cost has gone up. Because of that now progressive payroll tax, what the worker takes home doesn't look progressive anymore, because you have taxed more at the source, the high-skilled worker and the low-skilled worker. This is a point to say, yes, these institutions have a huge impact on inequality. And so does unionization, and so do have minimum wages. The one thing I want to point out is that if, and of course, there's other reasons why inequality has changed that we see change, but if the source in part of inequality and of this wage stagnation is due to these dominant firms, then, these institutions can adjust it, but they cannot really resolve the problem. I don't want to enter into the details, but you can never get rid of the kind of negative effect that firms have a dominant position. You can redistribute, you can smoothen the impact, you can make it less severe, but you don't get rid of the cause. Now, we can get into the reasons why that is, but really so let me put it this way: institutions are tremendously important, but they will never get rid of the root cause unless these institutions attack the dominant position, and this is then an antitrust institution. Okay, so that's on your first point. Your second point, again, I cannot agree more that the pandemic, and as the work you cited makes clear, is a form of increased fast technological change. I mean, the digitization has been sped up because of the pandemic. And we have looked a little bit into our analysis, what has happened since March 2020. And one of the things we see is that indeed all these consequences and all these effects that we're measuring have actually sped up. And we see that the stock market had a huge rise since the pandemic. Of course, there was an initial drop because there was uncertainty, but then the rise has been faster than it was before. And these, wage consequences, it's true that we see a recovery of some of the wages, but we also get inflation. So now the question is what's going to happen to real wages. And it's not just the level, we see an increase in the inequality over such a short period. Because of course there's a number of people who've been left out. So yes, I think of the pandemic as being more of the same, more of this fast technological change. Again, the hero part because it's good in many ways, but the villain part that it also leads to these negative consequences. And then your third question was, I talk about increasing competition, what kind of competition it is. And I would like to say, you mentioned the invisible hand and institution. And here I agree too, because I believe that the invisible hand doesn't work without institutions. That is, the invisible hand needs to be held. The invisible hand needs guidance. If you don't have institutions that enforce laws, but also that enforce antitrust, that enforce situations in which firms have a dominant position and therefore can exploit a dominant position, well, that's not the invisible hand. That's not what Adam Smith had in mind. Okay, and so in a way, what we really want to do is we want to kind of hold the arm maybe or the wrist such that the hand can invisibly work, but we really have to intervene through regulation and to ensure that the conditions for the right functioning of these markets are right. So, as you said, institutions are crucial for that, and these institutions have to be in place in order to ensure that where the market is not working, it can kind of get a nudge in order so that it does work. I also want to say that for most of the goods that we produce and consume, markets are fairly competitive. I look at this pen, I look at a lot of stuff that I use on a daily basis. There is no problem with scale or with dominance of these firms. It is with electricity provision. It is with now platforms in a digital age. It's with social networks. It's with companies like Google and Amazon. Yes, but there's a lot of other things that are fairly competitive. And so our institutions are precisely needed, I believe, there where we can ensure that where competition doesn't exist, it can be helped to be implemented. So this is kind of my response. Again, I want to thank you for the thoughtful and the depth of your comments. I would like to say that, from the point of view that you brought up, maybe this sociological view, I think that there's many points in which I think economists agree with sociologists. I don't think there is a different kind of conflicting view on things. Of course, we all come from different backgrounds, but we look at the same realities, we look at the same data, we look at the same phenomena. And I think that at least what I get from this discussion is that there's very much agreement in terms of what the issues are at stake. Thank you, Valeria.
Thank you to you, Jan. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. And I would like now to open up the discussion a little bit with our audience, starting perhaps with 4 questions from our audience members. Perhaps I can collect them 2 by 2, Jan, and we can conclude our webinar like this. The first one is there a link with wages being replaced with stock options, the decline in interests on savings, and the popularization of the stock market? That is the first question. And then second comment and question is, Playing the devil's advocate, one could argue that the concentration of wealth in a smaller number of firms is not an issue per se, but that this wealth should trickle down and generate broad-based growth. The issue is that this is no longer happening sufficiently. What would be your view and your response to this statement?
Okay, so let me answer each of these questions in turn. Of course, the use of stock options, we have to be very wary that this is for a very limited number of individuals. And it's true that a lot of the inequality that we see is coming from this very top range of people, and many of these people, you don't have to be a CEO to get stock options now. You may be a programmer in a tech firm and you get stock options. So yes, stock options play a role in this this inequality. Now, related to, I guess, the second question about the concentration of wealth, of course, if the wealth is in the economy, then not necessarily are we so concerned about where it is. Of course, it creates inequality, but as you mentioned, or as the person who asked the question mentions, this may trickle down. The point when there's market power is that there's an inefficiency. Let me give you the example of a cell phone that's being sold for 1,000 euros, right? And the cost of producing it is typically 250 or 300 euros. What happens is that there's a bunch of customers who would buy one at 300, at 400, 500, 600, 700, okay, who are now not buying one, whose reservation value, as we call it, is below what the price is. Now, what that has for an effect is that there's basically, a number of people that are priced out of the market. And that is where the effect is on the total amount of wealth. Even if you don't care about the distribution of wealth, what this market power does is it destroys wealth that it wouldn't have to destroy if it was priced in a competitive fashion. And that is the big kind of cost. That's the economic cost. We measured that. We measured this economic cost to be around 8 to 10% of GDP. And this is enormous. This is very big every year, that basically GDP that is lost. Now you can say, what is the value of GDP? We can talk about this in a different discussion, but it's basically indicating that there's a huge amount of wealth that is lost in addition to this inequality. So the answer to that is that there is no trickling down, because that 8% is not reverting back to the economy. That has disappeared. And that is the big concern, on top, of course, of the additional concern that it creates inequality, of course, right? That if you put all the wealth in the hands concentrated of a few, then you have the polarization and the conflict within society on top of it. But I think the main point is that we don't see the trickle down. Why? Because the pricing is inefficient. If the pricing is inefficient, you price out people from the market, and this is what's causing this loss of GDP of 8 to 10%.
Thank you. And I will add two questions, which perhaps slightly raise some slightly critical points that can help us all kind of elaborate a little bit on these topics. First of all, if wealth is concentrated among a few successful large companies who employ only a small fraction of all workers, how does this affect the wages of the majority of workers? And then another question and comment, which instead asks, what are the limits of this solution that you present of allowing and maximizing competition? Should it be applied mainly to large technological firms or also in other fields? In particular, what about goods that can be seen as market goods but also affect fundamental rights, for example, housing? Back to you.
Thank you. These are excellent questions. So the first question is really at the heart of what what I try to explain in the book, and also what much of the research that's underlying this book is, that it's kind of in more technical research papers, is how does this concentrated wealth that's coming from the fact that, you know, there's a few firms that are very dominant, how does that affect everyone's wages? Let me first say there's a direct effect that also happens. You know, what we call monopsony, going back to John Robinson, is basically this idea that, you know, if Google is big and dominant, what they're doing is they're really, you know, exploiting their workers by paying them less. So Google is paying Google workers less. And some people have argued that this may be the case with Uber, for example, that it's paying its drivers too little. And that's a direct effect from the firm to its own workers. Now, in addition to this monopsony effect that affects wages, what we find is that the even bigger effect, and that this question is asking about, is going from the firms that have market power, have effects on the wages of, you know, workers that sell bread or that drive a truck, have nothing to do with Google. And in the question, there is this idea, well, but this is a small number of firms, and that's true. Unfortunately, these firms are so large in economic terms as a share of GDP, because these are global firms. So in the tech sector, it's clear that, you know, Apple is selling worldwide, Google is used worldwide, and the social networks from Facebook are used globally. But so are some of the retail firms like Walmart and Amazon, and so is Inditex, so is Booking.com, so are many of the ABM in Leuven is one of them, is one of the culprits. These are companies that are enormously impactful in economic terms, and what we see in the data is that they account for maybe 30–40% of GDP, even though it's only 300 or 400 firms. So they are enormously impactful economy-wide. And here comes the fact that even though ABM doesn't necessarily pay its own workers badly, what happens is, because ABM, together with Google, together with Booking.com, together with Facebook, this 30% of the economy has what we call an equilibrium effect. What happens is they price too high, people sell too little. They sell much in price, but not in quantity. Therefore, there's less production, and therefore there's less demand for labor. And that's where the wage effect is coming from. And we find in our research that that's accounting for about, you know, 80% of the wage stagnation that we see, and about 20% is coming from the monopsony effect, the direct effect of, you know, Google affecting its own workers' salaries, but that the majority is coming from this indirect effect. Now, it's not easy to explain, because, you know, it's not Google that's making one firm's wage decline, it's Google plus all these other firms that have 30% of GDP, and that their high pricing affects the demand for labor and has therefore these knock-on effects. And this is again where the no trickle down is coming from, right? That's where this effect is. The second question was regarding the limits of the solution. We talked, you know, with Valeria's discussion that, you know, of course, institutions are going to be key in part of the solution. So it's not going to be just about, you know, getting competition. Also, we have to be realistic that, you know, even with electricity markets today, we've tried for over 100 years and we still haven't figured out how to regulate them properly. So there's going to be limits to institutions to make this work, to make it become competitive. Is it only going to be technology, was the question? No, it's going to be all fields. It's going to be all, you know, ABM that is beer, I mean, has nothing to do with tech. Inditex is textiles. It has nothing to do with tech. Tech may be a factor in it in terms of how they create, through using tech, a dominant position, but it's going to be in all sectors, and the intervention is going to have to come in all sectors. But there's a lot of other things, like, you know, fundamental human rights that are important. One of the points I would like to kind of make here is that, to some extent, if you can address this issue of lack of competition, what this is going to do is it's going to basically reduce the inequality, because the wages are going to go up, the inequality is going to go down. The tension from not having this extreme concentration of wealth, from not having this dominant position of these firms, is going to lead to lower polarization. So it's going to address already a lot of things that would be trying to address with other institutional settings. But again, you know, the limit of creating competition is going to require also many other institutional and regulatory settings to contribute to that. So this is going to have to be part of a much broader approach.
Thank you, Jan. And that is all the time that we have for today, I'm afraid. So I would really like to thank our guests, Professor Jan Eeckhout and Professor Valeria Pulignano, as well as all of our audience today for taking part in this webinar. Before leaving you, I would like to remind you that the Globe webinar series will continue next month with a webinar on the 8th of February, featuring Tobias Lenz on his new book, Inter-Organizational Diffusion and International Relations, Regional Institutions and the Role of the European Union. You can register for that webinar at globe-project.eu, where you can see the rest of our winter and spring lineup, and also watch all previous episodes of the Globe webinar series. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you again soon. From all of us at the Globe Project, thank you and goodbye.